We're continuing my free course here on Node.js and JavaScript for beginners, and in this video we're going to look at adding to arrays. So far we've seen how to create arrays, including two-dimensional arrays, but we've initialized them when we declare the variable. We've been declaring them and initializing them with data at the same time. But what we can also do is we can add data to existing arrays, or we can even just declare an empty array and then add data to that. So first of all, let's take a look at what we would do for one-dimensional arrays, in other words lists, because that's simpler than two-dimensional arrays. So let's declare an empty array. Let's say let fruits equal, and I'll use square brackets here to indicate just an empty array. So one way that you can add items to an array is just to use an index to set items, and the index that you use is the first index that's off the end of the array. So if I were to refer to fruits 0 here, because this has no items in it, fruit 0, which would normally be the first item, doesn't exist. It's off the end of the array already, but I can actually set that item to expand the array. So if I write fruits 0 equals orange, that will actually expand the array and add one item to it. Let's do console.log fruits 0 to check that it works. And this is well supported by all browsers, and as far as I know, all major browsers, and has been for a long time. So here I'm going to run my program to check that I'm in the right place. Yep. So let's do node and adding to arrays.js, and we can see we've got orange in that array. So let's do another one. What's the first item? What's the index of the first item that would now be off the end of the array now? That would now be 1. So we've got an array here with one item in it. So the maximum index that we can use to access items is 0. So if I pick the next index, it's just off the end of the array, 1. I can set that to expand the array. Let's write fruits 1 equals apple. And we could also output the length of the array, console.log fruits.length. And if we try this, then we find we've got an array with 2 items in it. We're displaying only the first one. Let's display the second as well. The second item, which is at index 1. There we go, we've got orange and apple. Now this can seem counterintuitive if you've been programming in other languages, because many programming languages would not let you do this. JavaScript is in many ways unusually flexible. For example, if you did this in a C program or a Java program, it would cause problems. You can't access or set elements of an array usually that are off the end of the array, but JavaScript lets you do it. However, there is another way of doing this that is more similar to how you would usually do this in probably most other programming languages, and that's to use a method called push. So a method is a subroutine. It's a kind of function, it's a collection of code that is associated with an object, and an array here is what we call an object in JavaScript. So you don't really need to know that yet. We're going to cover that later. But what you need to know is just how you actually do this. So let's write fruits, and we use the method called push. So push adds items to the end of an array. Let's do push and banana. And then I'm going to actually move this code up so we can get the new length of the array. And let's also output this new item, which is now going to be at index 2. So if we take a look at this, then we see we've now got banana in the array. Why is it called push? Well, we're kind of thinking of an array here as it's kind of a bit like a stack. A stack data structure is a data structure where the first item that we remove is the last one we added. So if you think of like a stack of cards, a deck of cards, you can put a card on the top and you can take it off again. In computer programming, those kinds of data structures are called stacks. Now an array is not a stack because we can read items from anywhere within the array. But this terminology, push, is used with stacks, and it indicates basically pushing something onto the top of a stack. In this case, we've got an array. If you think of it like a deck of cards, we're like putting a card on top of the cards, like pushing a card on top of the cards. It's a bit like that. I don't know if that information really helps, but we talk about pushing things onto the end of the array. And that terminology, I think, really comes from stack data structures. Okay, so we can iterate through our array as well, of course. We could do that in various ways. So let's maybe just use a for loop, a conventional for loop, which is, we've already seen that in the course. So let's do for let I equals 0, I less than fruits.length, I++, and we're going to see other ways of iterating through arrays later on in the course, and we'll access fruits I, because this is not necessarily the most convenient way to do this. Let's also output a blank line to kind of create some separation in our output. So if we look at the output now, here we can see we're iterating through the array. And you want to become really fluent with creating arrays, adding items to them, and iterating through them with a for loop. It's something you can just learn through practice. So how would we deal with a two-dimensional array? Well, with a two-dimensional array, the elements are themselves arrays. So let's create a two-dimensional array. Now we need kind of a table of something. So let's maybe write let animals equal, and again I'll set it equal to an empty array. Now there are various subtleties around this and various things you can do, but for our purposes here, this will be good to get us started. So we could add to the end of animals, for example, by using push. And what do we want to add? We want to add arrays. So let's say animals.push, and let's add the first row of this table. Now the thing that we want to push is itself going to be an array. So to denote an array, we write square brackets like this, and in there we can add a list of animals. Let's write dog, cat, and mouse. And that will add items to our two-dimensional array, and we could iterate through it using the technique that we saw in a previous tutorial. Or for now, I could just iterate through the outer array. Let's maybe put a blank line, again, console.log, and then do for let I equal 0, I less than animals.length now, I++. And we'll iterate through this array and output the elements in it, just as we did up here. And notice this I, the scope of it, in other words, the region where it exists, is just here. Outside of that, it doesn't exist. And that's why we can create a new I here. So I'm going to output animals I. And now we're outputting one row at a time. We've only got one row in it so far. So if I run this program, then we can see we've got an array of animals coming out, because the elements in this animals array are themselves arrays. And we can of course add more to it. So let's have another row in the table, and this time I'll put animals that I'm not familiar with, because we don't really have them in England, like tiger. Well, I am familiar with them. We just don't have them roaming about. Okay, lion and elephant. Kind of be nice if there were elephants in England. Probably a bit destructive, but anyway. Okay, so let's run this, and we can see down here, if you can see this, we've got two rows now. The second row is my sort of tropical type, or animals that we don't have in England. Okay, so that's it for this video. I'm going to give you an exercise in the next video which you can do to kind of improve your fluency with this if you want. The main thing to do though is just practice it, and practice typing it out. Probably if you're a complete beginner, inevitably you'll make mistakes, but that's the point of practice. You'll correct your mistakes, and eventually you'll stop making them so much. Okay, so until next time, happy coding. Continuing my free course on Node.js and JavaScript for complete beginners. In the last video we took a look at control characters, and we also saw how you can use process.standardout.write to write text without a new line appearing after it. In this video I'm going to give you an exercise that's going to use this stuff, and it's also going to use a lot of what we've seen so far in the course. So as always, I would say if you're a beginner, don't feel that you've got to plan out programs in your head at the start necessarily. That can hold you back. So if you have a program you want to write, whether it's an exercise or it's just something you've thought of, have a go at it. See how far you can get with it. Can you write any bits of it? Can you write something that's similar to what you actually want? Just have a go, get in there, type stuff, see what it does, experiment. And I think that's a lot more profitable than just staring at a blank sort of page and thinking, how would I start and complete and finish this program? Just launch into it. So I'll give you an exercise. You may find it very easy, but then again you may find it very hard. The important thing is just to try, or else if you don't do this, do some practice of your own, because you have to practice this stuff. You can't just watch videos. You've got to practice stuff to be able to use it. So bear in mind that when I give you this exercise, the thing to do is don't just look at a blank screen and be overwhelmed by it. Just have a go at it and see where you can get with it. See what bits you can do, So I'll describe the exercise, and then you can pause the video if you want to try it, and then I'll actually show you how to do it. Okay, so as usual, I'm going to start my multiplication.js here, my script, with use strict. So this exercise here is to create a multiplication table. That's not quite all the exercise though. So what we want to do is we want to end up, let's clear the console here, it's annoying me. So we want to end up, let's use a multi-line string here, a multi-line comment. We want to end up printing, in other words, displaying on the console, a multiplication table that looks something like this. So we have the times one sort of multiplications. Let's write 1, 2, separating these by tabs, and we go all the way up to eventually 1 times 10. Then on the next line we'll have 2, 4, 6, 8, all the way up to 20. And then we'll have some more lines, and then finally the last line will be 10, 20, 30, 40, all the way up to 100. Ideally these should be lined up, but if they're not exactly lined up, then that's okay. So we want to print this, in other words, output it on the console. It's the 10 times multiplication table, all the way from 1 times 1 to 10 times 10. And the dots are sort of bits you've got to fill in. But there's a little twist here, because I'm going to suggest that you create a two-dimensional array and fill all this data, all these numbers, into the two-dimensional array. And then later in your program, after some blank lines, write some code that outputs the entire content of that two-dimensional array. So the end result will be that you will print this 10 times 10 multiplication table, but you'll do it by first filling in a two-dimensional array, and then later on in your program you will work through that array and output it all. Okay, and these are tab characters separating the numbers, and after each line we have a new line character, so that each line comes out on a separate line. Alright, so if you want to have a go at that, pause the video now and try it, and don't forget, just try to do some bits you can. If you're overwhelmed by the whole thing, just simplify it. Can you even output these numbers? Never mind about the array, never mind the table. Can you output 1, 2, 3, 4 and so on? So start simple and build up and see where you can get with it. All right, so pause the video now if you want to try that. All right, so let's take a look at it. The first thing that we need is a two-dimensional array. And a two-dimensional array is a one-dimensional array where the elements are themselves arrays. So let's create a one-dimensional array. I'll just call it table. So let's say let table equal an empty square brackets to initialize it to an empty array. Now, if I wanted to just add one row to this table, I would create a loop like for let I equal 0, I less than 10, let's say, I plus plus. And then we could add values to that table. So I here will go from 0 to 9, which is not quite what we want, because even for the first row, we want 1 to 10, not 0 to 9, but it's a big step in the right direction. What if we wanted not just one row, but 10 rows? Well, then we could have a loop within our loop. So we could have let's call this j equals 0, j less than 10, j plus plus. Can we use that to fill a two-dimensional array with numbers? So could we even use it to create a multiplication table that goes from 0 times 0 to 9 times 9? Let's try that. So we want to add rows to our table. So within this outer loop, we've got to create rows. Every time we go around this loop, we need to create a row and add it to the table. So let's write we'll call it row equal an empty array. And then we can add values to this row in this inner loop. So row.push j. That would give us that would basically just loop around and create 10 rows, but we haven't added them to the table. So after we add some numbers to the row, let's do table.push and add the row to the table. So now we're adding 10 rows to our table where each row contains the numbers 0 to 9, which is a step in the right direction. Let's already see if we can display that. So we'll go down further in the program, and how would we display this? Well, we could display it with a nested loop again. So we need to, for each row, we need to work along the row and output the numbers. Let's try this. So let's have for int I equals 0, I less than 10. Actually, how big is this outer array? The length of it is table.length. Let's do that. And I plus plus. And then within that, that's not int, that should be let. I'm getting confused with C and Java. All right, so within that we can write for let j equal 0, j less than what? Well, we need to get a row out of the table. Let's do that. So how would we get a row from this table? How would we get the row, the ith row? We could write let row equal table I. And then the inner loop's got to iterate over this row. So we could write let j equal 0, j less than row.length and j plus plus. Then we can get values out of the row. So we could write let value equal row j. Let's display these values and see what we've got. I don't want to get each value on a new line, so let's use process dot, that's autocomplete being unhelpful, process esc dot standard out dot write, and we output value here. What does that give us? Let's have a look. Got to run the right file, that would help. So node multiplication.js. We've got an error. Why is there an error? Well, it's because process.standardout.write will not write numbers, it will only write strings. So as we saw in the last video, here we have to write to string. Let's try that. Yeah, well, we've got a load of numbers, but for one thing, we've got one massive line. We need new lines in there. Where should we put the new lines? So every time after we output a row, which we're doing here, we want a new line character. So we could use console.log to do that. Let's write console.log and just empty brackets and see how that looks. It's a lot better, but, well, the numbers are clearly not the right numbers, but they're halfway what we want, really. So can we separate the numbers by tabs? Well, after each write of a number, we want a tab character. So I could just add on a tab here with plus, or I could use another process .standardout.write. Let's try it. \t. What does that look like? Well, now we've got numbers. Now the only problem is we're outputting the first row. Well, that's not the only problem, but we're outputting the first row over and over again. It also starts at 0, which we don't want. So we need to now we're outputting this two-dimensional array successfully. We need to take a look at the content of it, which is not quite right. So to get the multiplication table, well, all I need to do really is multiply I by j. So multiply the sort of column index by the row index, really. So if I write let's write I times j. How does that look? Okay, let's zoom out and go back to the console. I did something wrong here. Oh no, there we go. Right. I'll just clear this and then output it. So now we've got, it is a multiplication table. The problem is it goes from 0 times 0 to 9 times 9. We want it to go from 1 times 1 to 10 times 10. Really what we want to do here is, instead of I times j, we want to add 1 to I and add 1 to j. So we can do that if we're going to have to use brackets to stop this expression that we're going to write being translated in the wrong way. But let's write I plus 1 in brackets times j plus 1. So that means that we add 1 to I before we multiply it, and then we multiply it by j plus 1. So let's run this. And we've got what we want. We've got 1 times 1 all the way up to 10 times 10. Okay, so if you did try this exercise and you got this printing out and you used a two-dimensional array to store the numbers and then access them again afterwards, then you've successfully completed the exercise, whether you use the exact same techniques that I've used here or something slightly different. If you tried the exercise and you just couldn't get it to work, then don't feel bad. You know, if you did anything at all, that's really great. And I would say if you didn't get the exercise to work, try typing out this code and, you know, see that it actually works. You'll learn a lot just by typing it out, and try experimenting with it and check that you understand it if possible. Try to see what's going on. If you don't quite understand something, why something's there or whatever, try removing it or changing it and see if you can figure out exactly what's going on here. That's a really good thing to do. So it was a difficult exercise if you are a complete beginner. So don't feel bad if you couldn't get this working, but now you've seen how it is done, try it out for yourself and check that you can get this code working. Don't forget you can find all the code for this course on github.com/caveofprogramming, all one word, and then go to my Node.js repository. But there isn't value for learning purposes, there isn't value really in copying and pasting code. What you need to do is type it out yourself, even if it might seem boring. And if you find yourself getting too bored by typing, don't forget you can learn to touch type. You know, if you search on the internet, there are lots of free touch typing programs that teach you to type without looking at the keyboard, and that can massively speed up your typing. Probably only half of programmers do touch type. You don't have to, but it can speed up your learning by making you essentially less reluctant to type stuff. And it's a bit tricky to learn at first, but after a few weeks of forcing yourself to just touch type with emails or whatever you write, then you'll get the hang of it, and it will speed up your learning, I think, with coding quite a lot. But anyway, okay, so we'll leave it there for this video. Until next time, happy coding.